Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, we're back with another runner-up ranking, and this one being probably the most requested of the bunch. And here we're going to be doing my Big Brother US runner-up rankings. So with this video, I will not be including BB1 as, it's BB1. There was no real game there. And I also not be including BBOTT or Celebrity Big Brother, as those are completely different games. Though Celebrity might be included when I eventually get around to doing a North American runner-up ranking, though who knows when that will be. So for this video, we'll be ranking the 21 runners-up of the main US seasons. So let's start off with number 21. And I have a feeling this might not be a popular opinion. I don't feel like this person is commonly looked at as the worst runner-up in Big Brother history. And I will say, I don't think this is the worst player to be a runner-up. I do think their runner-up game here is massively flawed for me. And at 21, the worst runner-up for me is Danny Donato from BB8. And the reason for that is a lot of the reason why I have Evil Dick so low on the list. And that's because of how much their games relied on luck. Danny, to be honest, probably even more so than Dick, in the situation that, really, Danny gets helped out largely in the game by the fact that Evil Dick was so popular. And a lot of that was because of his relationship with Danielle. If it wasn't for Dick being as popular as he was with the public at the time, Danny has absolutely no shot on this season. She does come into the game, obviously, with this pre-built alliance with Evil Dick. You could say, they were on bad terms when they came in, and obviously that's true to a degree, but it's they still had a built-in alliance. They auditioned together for BB6 in the past. There was no way they weren't going to be working together coming into the season, which is an advantage they had over every other player on the season. Especially when the other two rival pairs were pairs that were never going to work with each other. She does face some adversity by being targeted by Jen and is able to win vetoes and save herself at points. She is part of the main majority initially, though they are on the outskirts of that majority, especially when they decide to flip on Eric. And that should have been the end of her game. Her flipping on Eric and failing to actually take him out should have been the end. Dick was going home at that final 9 round, but even then, to be honest, Danny should have been going home at that final 9 round because Dick used the veto on Danny when really he should have obviously used it on himself if this was a more self-interested player. But due to their pre-game relationship, obviously he was more incentivized to use the veto on her. Again, that is a scenario where Danny would have gone home had she had not had her father in the game. Plus also the fact that her father stays in the game because he's well liked by America, and America forces Eric to save him. And the reason why he's more liked by America is because of his relationship with Danielle, where the audience sympathized with him being a father trying to earn back the love of his daughter. And that was a thing that really attached the audience to him. And again, all this are things that are not repeatable. These are things that are very luck based, where she got lucky she got put on the cast with Evil Dick. She is lucky that her relationship is so bad with Evil Dick in terms of their personal relationship that sympathy was gained for Evil Dick, to where even Danny wasn't even liked by the public, mind you. Again, this was solely Dick, and through Dick being liked by the public, he's able to help her out within the game. And obviously we get to the point towards the end of the season where they're able to win out. Eventually, they're able to blindside Eric, but then at Final 5, Final 4, Final 3, they're able to win the comps that they need in order to get to the end. But again, this is such a luck-dependent game, a game that is not repeatable, a game that had so many instances outside of Danielle's control for her to be able to get to the runner-up position to begin with. So for all those reasons, again, for me, I just don't really have much positive to say about Danielle, especially on a runner-up ranking where she shouldn't have been the runner-up to begin with. She shouldn't have been here, largely due to the amount of luck that she had throughout the season. So for me, she lands at number 21. Now number 20, in a pretty similar vein, though I do feel like this person had more agency at points within the game, I guess, and that is Ryan from BB9. And the biggest knock for Ryan for me is the fact that he was voted out. He was voted out on the final round with the duos twist. With the way that the game had functioned up until that point, he is essentially voted out of the game. He had lost the game, but gets lucky in the fact that that was the final round with the duos twist, and in turn gets a second chance by going to another vote where it's between him and his partner Alison, and Alison ends up going home. Mind you, Alison was a lot of the reason why he was getting targeted to begin with during that week, but still, I mean, like, he was essentially voted out and gets saved due to a change in the format that he couldn't have predicted. So for me, that is a major knock, though I did debate over how major of a knock it was, largely because I feel like Ryan is someone that, again, like, did very little to get himself in that position that week. Again, it was all Alison that really ruined her relationships with people like a Joshua and a Chelsea, the people in power that week, that caused them to be targeted and eventually voted out. And really what it comes down to is that, like, that flaw, like the fact of him being voted out and coming back into the game, like, it's really bad, but I wasn't going to let it determine how I thought about his game as a whole. But then I analyzed the rest of his game as a whole, and I realized the rest of his game's pretty bad as well. And because it's so bad, I was like, you know what, screw it, let's just put him where I would normally put a person that had been voted out of the game, because it's like the rest of his game's pretty bad. I mean, like, again, like, earlier on, he does come into the game with a pre-game relationship with Jen, his girlfriend at the time, and he decides to just tell people about it. He tells Alison, and after that, they start spreading it through the house, and that makes them the target for that week and puts him on the block against Jen, to where he does stay, and you have to credit him for that, but still, it's like not a great situation. Obviously, he does get evicted a couple weeks later, but again, largely due to Alison. Again, this was the season with the duos twist where people were voted out in pairs, at least for the first half of the game, and does get saved by that round being the round that the players were eventually split. He does win the next HOH, and I think he handles that terribly. And while I do think he ends up making the correct move in taking out James, who is essentially the leader of the opposite side of the house, the way he misleads that opposite side in order to essentially make them think that he's going to flip with them is just terrible. I mean, to be fair, I mean, like, he was going to flip with them at a point and decided to backtrack at the last second. But again, I just think he completely mishandles that situation there, and that causes him to be the target the next week when James comes back into the game, which was partially unlucky that James came back, but also, I mean, if any of James's alliance had one HOH, it would have been the same result anyway. Ryan was the initial target, though the target does flip to Maddie. Again, how much do you credit Ryan with that? Not much, in my opinion. But from that point forward, his alliance is able to run the table. They win comp after comp after comp in order to reach the end game. And during that time, he's able to build a final two with Adam. Now, another reason why I decided to put Ryan so low is because I also feel like he just made terrible moves with his power. At the final four and final three, he makes decisions that actively benefit Adam. He pretty much allows Adam to win the game. He allows Adam to run his end game. At the point where Ryan votes out Sharon at the final four is completely asinine on his end, as he completely burned Shannon to the point where he's never able to recover and get her jury vote, which is one that he really needed if he wanted to win the game. But he also allows Adam to get to the end with Sheila, someone who was going to take Adam to the end of the game had she won final HOH. So really, for me, I just feel like Ryan completely blows up his end game. He ends up losing in a 6-1 vote with no real possibility of getting any of the 6 votes that didn't go his way. I just really feel like Ryan played such an actively bad game throughout the season, plus also has the fact that he was voted out. That makes him land at number 20. Now, I will say that despite me thinking Ryan played such a terrible game, he was at least more active in the game than the next few entries on the list. So, I mean, I think that's something you have to at least credit him with. And to be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that he was voted out, I probably would have him a few spots higher, probably closer to like the 15, 16 sort of range. But due to the fact he was voted out, I just feel like there's nothing to really justify putting him too high on the list, so he ends up landing at number 20. Now at number 19. At number 19, we do have many people probably expecting to be number 21. I do think this is probably the worst player to be a runner-up in the history of Big Brother, and I do think her game on this season is pretty terrible. But here at number 19, we do have it, Gina-Marie from BB17. And Gina-Marie, for me, played really poorly. I mean, like, if we run through her game, I mean, right off the bat, she's not in the majority group. She's part of the cool kids group with, like, Aaron and Caitlin, but she's completely left out of that first vote where David does end up going home. She's blindsided there. Very next round, she gets blindsided again, where Nick, who she perceived to be her closest ally, gets taken out of the game. And following that, the next few rounds, she sees some of her closest allies get taken out one by one. She sees Jeremy go home. She sees Caitlin go home. with really no agency within the game at that point. She does still have a very close alliance with Aaron, but that's pretty much all she has at this point in the game. However, due to how small of a threat she is, she's never really targeted. We do get to the first round of the jury where she is able to win HOH and she does target Candace, which is just a terrible move. Not necessarily targeting Candace, I don't think that's the worst move in the world, but the way that she handles that, where she really just gathers no respect from her cast, and I think that's a big indication of the fact that she was never winning a jury vote. She just skates through the next few weeks and is eventually able to be part of the Exterminators alliance that does end up running the endgame. However, she was also the most expendable person of the Exterminators alliance. The core of the Exterminators alliance was Andy and Spencer, and they did have Judd and Gina-Marie kind of on the side there. And I think the reason why she does get further into the game within that alliance is because she is, again, a non-threat, someone that's never going to win the game. Now, she does obviously make the move to take out Amanda, but again, it wasn't really her move. Again, she was pretty much just following the orders of Andy at that point. And from that point on, she's pretty much just dragged to the end by Andy, where Andy is able to take her to the end, use her as a reason to vote for him, where he makes up this loyalty he had to Gina-Marie from the very beginning of the game, that in the case that people were bitter, he can at least claim that he was loyal. So, I mean, that's something that's there. And also, really, just Andy was going to beat her anyway. He steamrolls her at the end of the game. Really, again, Gina-Marie, for me, is someone that had no respect within the game, had no real control within the game. And the only moments where she did have some semblance of control, it was mostly her doing the actions that benefited other people more than it benefited her. I don't see how Gina-Marie ever wins the game. She lands at number 19. Now we're number 18. We are on to another person who I do feel like, again, had very little agency within the game and had very little respect within the game. At number 18, we do have Erika from BB7. Now, Erika, for me, played just a really passive game throughout most of this season. But despite her playing a really passive game, she was still being targeted by certain people throughout most of the game, and that's even worse. Where, like, she was being targeted despite not really even being a threat to win the game. Like, I don't see any endgame scenario that she ends up winning. She loses against Janelle, she loses against Boogie, she loses against Will, she loses against Danielle. Maybe she can beat Chicken George, but she actively voted out Chicken George. I mean, like, really, there's no scenario where Erika ends up winning the game. But she was still being targeted by multiple people throughout the season. She was the initial target at the Final Four, where Janelle was going to vote out Erika until she found out about Chilltown's scheming there. She did get targeted by Janelle during the double eviction and would have gone home had she not won the veto there. She was again the target for Janelle during Final 9, where Janelle wanted Erika to go home over Marcellus, but it's due to the grace that the other house guests didn't want that Marcellus does go home. Erika was on the block against Howie, where Erika very nearly goes home in a 3-2 vote. Again, like, for me, it's like Erika was in so much danger throughout the season and had no real control throughout the season, despite her not being a threat to win the game. And for me, that's really bad. Obviously, she's a better player than Gina-Marie, but I mean, at least Gina-Marie was safe throughout a lot of the game. So for me, to be honest, there was a thought of, like, should Erika be lower than Gina-Marie? And we also have, like, Erika taking out Danielle herself, which is, like, a move that's completely against her best interests, where Danielle was someone that was much more likely to take her to the end of the game than Will or Boogie. I mean, she actively tries to get far into the game with a duo in Mike and Boogie, who were going to take each other to the end, so that's really bad as well. However, again, I think you have to give her credit for flipping Janelle against Will. Now, obviously, that was the obvious move at the point. I mean, there was really no other move to make. She had to do that. But the fact that she was able to execute on that is something that you have to give her some credit for, and that's really the only reason why she's above Gina-Marie, because, like, to be honest, even though I hate Gina-Marie's game, it's like I do feel like Erika somehow has actually played worse throughout most of this season. But that is a move that I will give Erika sole credit for, though, I mean, I guess you can also give credit to Will for messing it up, but whatever. I do think Erika gets credit there, so for me, that's enough to land her slightly above Gina-Marie here at number 18. Now, number 17, another runner-up that had very little agency for a good chunk of the game, though I do think they kick it up a bit towards the end game, and that is Porsche from BB13. And I think Porsche plays the first half of her season really terribly. I mean, like, I think she had no clue what was going on for pretty much the entire first half of the game. Mind you, she was safe due to the format of the season, of the pairs, and once Keith goes home, she's safe for the next few rounds. But even then, Porsche almost goes home in that first vote. It's due to the vets fighting to keep her that she does end up staying. It has almost nothing to do with what Porsche was actually doing within the game. And even then, like, Porsche just didn't make social bonds with many people. She spent most of her time hanging out with Rachel. And through that, completely isolated certain other people within the game, like Jeff and Jordan. Eventually, obviously, that vet alliance does blow up, and during that time, she does stick by Rachel initially, which again isn't necessarily the greatest move, considering Rachel and Brendan were the biggest targets on that side. But then once Brendan goes home, she decides to flip over to the newbie side, along with Danny. Obviously becomes part of a core group there of like Danny, Porsche, and Kalia, and they're able to win some comps for a bit, until Danny obviously gets eventually taken out. Though that's where her game finally kicks up a bit. Obviously, Kalia wins the double eviction HOH. Porsche wins the veto. They're able to get rid of Jeff, which is a pretty big move there. She wins the next HOH. And through that, I mean, essentially, Porsche should have had a relatively easy ride to the end. I mean, at that point, I do think Porsche is decently positioned, where obviously she has a final two with Kalia at that point. She still has the relationship with Rachel that she can cling on to. And she's obviously not as big of a threat as those two players. However, her game does blow up by Pandora's box, which harms her in a way, but also I do think benefits her to a degree as well. Because I do think keeping Rachel in the game is actually beneficial to Porsche. I do think if Porsche got rid of Rachel, it actually harms her positioning. She needs to get rid of Jordan. However, Rachel is more than likely going to go home if that twist doesn't happen. Well, depending on how the veto plays out. I mean, I think most of her game actually plays out still relatively well after that. I mean, she does need to win Final Four veto. I mean, that is something that you can count against her. But at Final 3, I mean, she's getting taken to the end either way. And if she gets to the end against Adam, she does win the game. The problem is that she was actively going to take Rachel to the end. So she really just wasn't even going for the scenario where she does win the game. But it was a scenario that could have happened there. But overall, when I look at her game, I mean, I really just look at the first half of her game as almost non-existent. I really feel like her first half of the game is just extremely passive, and there's really not much to praise there. Her second half of the game is essentially that of a mid-tier player in my eyes, but that's only the second half of her game. I mean, when I combine the two halves of her game together, I do still think she's a bottom-tier runner-up. While she did have some winning scenarios, she actively sabotaged her chances of getting those winning scenarios, while also rarely being in the majority of the game, so for me, she still lands at number 17. Now at number 16, we have someone that I kind of debated putting a little bit higher, but then when actually looking at his gameplay, I don't really feel like a lot of it was intentional. So at number 16, I do have Michael Cowboy Ellis from BB5. And this is the tough thing. I think in many ways you can consider him a second in command to Drew, which if he was fully a second command, that would bump him up on the list to around number 10, actually. Like, it would bump him up a good chunk. However, I think when reassessing his game, I do look at him as more so of a person who is mostly just dragged throughout the game. He was someone that was rarely in the majority alliance. I mean, he does obviously be a part of that Four Horsemen's group that does form, but that group never really had that much control in the game, and they never actually had the numbers to control a vote. And by the time that Diane wins HOH in week 4, I mean, that group is pretty screwed. And he really is just a loyal soldier for that group, where even when it's crumbling, he's still sticking by Jace when Jace is the very obvious boot during that week. And Drew does a lot of the legwork with building bonds with Marvin and pulling in Diane and really just managing that side a lot better. But then they get the opportunity to take out a member from that side, so Drew flips back, and they take out Will, and then after that, Michael's really just used as a pawn for a good chunk of the game afterwards. And really, by the grace of Drew, I do feel like Cowboy gets to the end of the game. I mean, if we get to the final 6, he's obviously safe due to Drew being HOH. At the final 5, he largely gets saved due to the fact that Diane decides to flip on Karen Nokomis and win the veto and save them. Now, obviously, there's still a chance that Drew goes home that week, though if Drew goes home, Michael's in an even worse spot the next round where he's the very clear next boot. But there's also the chance that Cowboy goes home that week too, because obviously Diane wasn't voting out Cowboy. So Nokomis and Karen would have had to go against Diane's wishes. So that's another element of that. At the final four, he is pretty safe. I mean, I don't think he gets voted out by anyone. I mean, Nokomis could have voted him out, but I don't feel like that's the case. I do feel like she probably votes out Diane. But really, it takes him until the final four veto for him to win a comp, which is something that's pretty indicative of his game. And then we get to the final three, where really he just needs Diane to not win the final HOH and is able to make it through, obviously, when Drew wins HOH. And then we get to a jury vote where he does lose by 1 vote. I mean, he does get a 4-3 vote, which is mind-blowing in itself. But if we look at the votes that he was given, it's like one was Nokomis, which was a vote that essentially he was only going to get because he was her half brother. I mean, she even pretty much just states that. I mean, I do think that is an element of this game, is that he was also lucky that he was put in with his half sister. Mind you, obviously he didn't know she was his half sister, and like that entire story, the fact that this happened on Big Brother is ridiculous. But that is still something that adds to his jury chances, as he always had that locked 1 vote. Plus also he has the locked votes of Natalie and Adria as well, just because he was nice to them and he was Christian. So that was something. So I mean, he always came into that final vote with 3 pretty locked votes. But again, what did he actually do to get those votes? I mean, really nothing with Nokomis's, and then the bare minimum with the twins. So I mean, really for me, again, like Cowboy, I do feel like he was dragged for most of the game. I do feel like Drew did all of the legwork to get Cowboy to the end. And despite Cowboy almost winning the game, it's largely due to him having 3 locked votes, while I don't really feel like there was a chance he was getting any of the 4 other votes. So again, for me, Cowboy, mostly mediocre game. He ends up landing at number 16. Now number 15, we have another player that played a pretty similar game to Cowboy, if I'm being honest. I mean, to be honest, there's a lot of correlations here. So at 15, I do have Liz Nolan from BB17, and this is kind of a similar situation to a degree. I think first up, we have the fact that obviously she was, again, lucky to come in with a twin, with Julia, that allowed her to really become insulated within the power structure. I mean, when we have someone like Vanessa in a game that knew the benefit of having twins in the game that are under her control, I mean, that definitely benefited their positioning within the game, despite them not being within the main power structure very early on in the game. I do think you have to credit Liz with getting Austin on their side. That, again, allows them to further get within the power structure that forms a little bit later in the game. Though, again, how much of that was Liz's actual gameplay? Probably very little. Through the relationship with, obviously, her twin and Julia and Austin, that gets her locked jury votes at the end of the game. Again, kind of a similar situation to Cowboy there. And I do think she was largely dragged through the game. I do think Vanessa largely just drags her through that end game portion of the game in order to beat her at the end. The difference, though, for me between her and Cowboy is that at least she was within the main power structure for a lot longer in the game. Again, Cowboy was not even within the majority group for a lot of the game. It was really just being dragged along because he's such a non-threat. Liz here was part of the majority group. I mean, she had the core of the Oz twins, of her, Julia, and Austin, with her being the connecting piece between the 3. She also had the main power structure with Vanessa, that through that had Steve, and that group was able to run the table there. There were obviously points where she was completely out of the loop. I mean, she was out of the loop on the Austin boot. She was out of the loop on the Vanessa boot, which is obviously ironic considering it was either her or Vanessa. But I mean, like, really, Liz, for me, like, really had no clue what was going on for a good chunk of the game, but was at least more insulated within the power structure of the game than someone like a Cowboy. So for me, that's why she lands here at number 15. Now number 14, we have someone that is a debatable second command. The problem is that she was the second command to someone that didn't end up running the game, or at least the entirety of the game, and that person is Natalie from BB11. And for me, Natalie's just a really tough game to really wrap my head around, because I do feel like she played a pretty solid second command game for the first half of the game, where Jesse was running the game, and obviously her game gets completely decimated by the fact that the coup d'etat comes into play. But even then, I feel like Natalie is someone that just, again, simply didn't gather the respect of the jury. I mean, similar to like an Erika and a Gina-Marie, I do think she is someone that just never had the respect that she needed to win the game. I do think she gets jury votes under certain scenarios. I mean, obviously we saw that she got jury votes. She gets the votes of Kevin and Russell, but it's like, I just never felt like she actually could win a jury vote. And the fact that she loses the vote of Jesse, her closest ally, is really indicative of the amount of respect that the players had for her. Mind you, she does also get unlucky with the fact that Shima was ejected, which in turn loses her jury vote. If she gets to the end where, she probably does lose still in the 4-3 vote, where really Jesse becomes the main swing vote at the end against Jordan if Shima had been on the jury. But still, it's like, I just can't see her winning a jury vote. I don't know who she wins a jury vote against. I think she loses to Michelle, to Kevin, to Jeff. It's like, who does she win against? There's nobody. And I think a lot of that has to do with her own actions. She just seems really annoying, but also she gets into confrontations for no real reason. She gets into confrontations that aren't even about her. Fights like over how other people are being treated. And it's like, why are you doing that? You don't need to do that. She makes a lot of unnecessary lies. Like the fact that she lies about her age is like completely pointless. The fact that she lies about like her athletic background is really dumb. It's like, why are you lying about these things? Especially because people are going to eventually find out anyway. But as I said, she was pretty much the second command for Jesse for the entirety of the first half of the game. Mind you, even then, Jesse loses some of his control at points. Ronnie does go home in week 4, which is something that was very much against their best interests, and Natalie is on the wrong side of the vote for that vote. She obviously is on the block against Jesse when Jesse goes home, and that's something that she didn't want to happen. But again, that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for coup d'etat. But even then, I don't think she was the most well positioned at that point in the game, as Jesse was the very clear big target for the opposition at that point. And I do think if they couldn't get rid of Jesse, they more than likely would have gotten rid of Natalie. Now, I do think you have to give her some credit for getting Jeff to target Russell at the final 6. However, I think first off, you would give a lot more credit to Kevin for that than to Natalie. But also, I do feel like that move in its own right has always been kind of overblown, where I feel like just naturally Jeff would have targeted Russell during that round anyway, just due to Jeff never really fully trusting Russell to begin with. She does vote out Jeff, which is, again, her only move at that point. At the final 5, she kind of has to do that. At the final 4, she wins HOH, and again, just handles it really terribly, where she starts thinking that she's running the house and everything. It's like, it's final 4 HOH. You have no control over this. And then even gets to a situation where in the final 3, Kevin cuts Natalie. Kevin's talked about, he would have taken Jordan to the end, which I think is, again, really indicative of just Natalie not playing well. Where Kevin easily beats Natalie. Kevin has a much harder road against Jordan than Natalie. So really for me, again, I just feel like Natalie plays terribly. I really have nothing super positive to say about Natalie. The only reason she's as high as she is because, again, she was part of that main power structure earlier on in the game. And I do think she played more individually than someone like a Liz, where Liz, I don't think ever really played within her best interest. I think she largely just followed the orders of others, while I do think Natalie played more individually, where she was someone that was more actively scheming within the game. But again, for me overall, Natalie still plays pretty poorly. She lands at number 14. Now at number 13, we have someone that's kind of similar to Natalie. I do think better in almost every aspect, but still relatively similar, and that is Ivette from BB6. I think Yvette's in a similar situation. She was the second command to someone or two people really that ran the game. She was first second command to Eric, and then once Eric goes, she's second command to Maggie. Now, I think the difference here is that Maggie actually did run the game all the way through, which I think already gives some merit to Yvette. However, the problem I have with Yvette, and the reason why she's not in that second in command tier, which is essentially the middle tier of this list, again, we're still in the bottom tier, and to be honest, there's still one more person in this bottom tier. But the reason why I don't consider her a full second command is because of how poorly she played at points within the game. Because I do feel like, unlike a lot of the people that I do consider part of the second tier of the list, I do feel like those players played relatively optimally, but then just made a mistake at the end game that cost them the game. However, when we talk about Yvette, I just feel like Yvette played really terribly throughout. Again, she's another one that just treated people really terribly, got into fights for no real reason. She didn't need to do that. Like her fights with Kaser earlier on in the season, she would fight with April towards the back half of the season, which I do think actively ruins that jury vote. In her goodbye message to Rachel, she really just blasts her on the way out, which essentially costs her the game. I think she wins the game had she not have done that. I guess you can say like, oh, she almost won the game. That's something impressive to say about her. But it's like she actively ruined her chance of winning the game also. It's like Rachel coming into the jury house should have been more inclined to vote with the Sovereign Six and in turn vote for Ivette to win the game. But due to her own actions, she causes Rachel to flip to Maggie, giving Maggie the win. And to be honest, that is something that I do massively knock against Maggie. But just because I knock it against Maggie, that's not something I can really prop up with Ivette either. I think it's bad on both of their games that happen. It's bad for Maggie, as that's a level of luck that she couldn't account for that caused her to win the game. But it's also bad for Ivette because she actively ruined her game. I also feel like the final 3 was handled really terribly by her as well, where she should have thrown the final HOH to Janelle, had Janelle vote out Maggie, and in turn Ivette also wins the game in that scenario as well. Like, Ivette is someone that should have won this season had she played a better game, had she been a better player. But because of how bad of a player she is a runner-up here. She could have won against Maggie had she not blown up her relationship with Rachel. She could have won against Janelle had she just allowed Janelle to win final HOH. Ivette was just too blindly loyal to Maggie, plus also the fact that she treated people terribly throughout the season. And because of all the actively bad things that she did within the game, for me, she does end up landing here at number 13. Now, number 12, we have the top of the bottom tier for me. Someone that, again, I debated on whether or not to include her as a second command player. However, I think the difference here for me is, again, I think she was the second command to a player that didn't end up running the game despite them winning the game. But either way, at number 12, we do have Holly from BB21. And again, I very much consider her game a second in command to Jackson. However, the problem is I don't look at Jackson as a dominant player. Like, if she was the second command to someone that dominated the game, like some of the people that we'll be talking about a bit later, then I would consider her a mid-tier runner-up. However, she was the second command to Jackson, who is someone that had some control throughout the game, had a lot of control at certain points, especially in the end game, but a lot of that was due to competition wins. He never really socially integrated himself to become a dominant figure within the back portion of the game, and through that causing massive damage to his ranking on my winner ranking, I think that also causes damage to Holly's ranking on my runner-up ranking here. Now, I do think Holly played more individually for the first half of the game, and I actually think Holly played pretty well, actually, for the first half of the game, where I do think she had actually probably been a more likely winner than Jackson for the first half of the game. And in many ways, at that point, I guess you can say that Jackson was the second command to Holly. However, I think Holly just takes a back seat once the 6 shooters blows up. Again, before that, she had a lot of really good bonds with the 6 shooters themselves and even with people outside the 6 shooters like Kat and Nicole. But after 6 shooters blows up, she really just gives all the control to Jackson and allows Jackson to just do whatever he wants. The only time she wins HOH during that period is when she gets rid of Nick, which was something that she was really hammering on. But even then, it's like, that was kind of the obvious move at that point in the game. The entire back portion of the game, she's just consistently getting saved by Jackson and does things that are against her own best interests. At the final 5, she directly gets saved by Jackson. To where if it wasn't for Jackson fighting so hard to get Cliff and Nicole to stick to their word, Holly more than likely goes home there at the final 5. At the final 4, Holly throws the final 4 HOH, which is against her best interest as it gives Jackson an out had he lost the veto. And in turn, more than likely, Holly would have been a likely boot at that point if Jackson and Holly had been on the block. Mind you, I do think Cliff probably still decides to vote out Jackson, but it was definitely something that harmed Holly's game and propped up Jackson's game. And we obviously see at the end of the game where Jackson wins final HOH and takes Holly to the end and really just demolishes her in the jury vote. Again, for me, it's strange because it's like Holly was more active in the first half of the game. I do think she played better in the first half of the game, but then her game just completely dissipates, especially once she lets go of Kat, and she really has no control from that point forward. But that first half of the game that was really strong in my eyes is enough to land her at the top of the bottom tier here at number 12. Now in number 11, and we're starting the middle tier of the list here. Again, most of these people in the middle tier here for me are pretty much second command players. However, we are starting it off with 2 players that weren't really second command players, but more so just really messy players. And we're starting off with number 11 here, a game that seems to be pretty renowned for some reason that I never really fully understood, and that is the game of Paul Abrahamian from BB18. Now, the thing about Paul is that on this season of BB18, I think he was like the perfect underdog. Like, he was the person that he was consistently being put on the block. He was on the bottom a good chunk of the game, but was able to overcome that over and over and over again. I mean, he's on the bottom during week 2, but is able to integrate himself with Paulie to the point where he becomes part of the core of the house. As obviously they make the executives and the board and all this stuff, and like, he's put into a decent position at that point. He does obviously get benefited by the fact that Victor comes back into the game, which gives him an extra number and an extra shield as well. That does help him later on in the game. Paul and Victor eventually flip on Paulie, and that ends up pretty much backfiring them right away, where Nicole is able to flip Natalie on Paul and Victor, and Victor gets voted out again, comes back into the game again, and he's able to then reintegrate himself within the majority again by making a Final Four deal with Corey and Nicole. That allows him to stay safe for the next few rounds. I do think he makes a misstep by voting out Natalie over James, as I do feel like Natalie was more incentivized to stick with Victor and Paul than she was with Nicole and Corey. And at the Final 5, he's fully saved by the fact that Victor's still in the game, where he's directly on the block against Victor, and he more than likely goes home if he's on the block against anybody but Victor at that point in the game, but gets saved there and is able to comp out to the end at that point, where he wins Final 4 HOH, Final 4 veto, and Final 3 HOH. Again, for me, it's a very sloppy game, especially because like, he doesn't win at the end. Like, if this had been a winning game, then at least you can give him some credit for facing so much adversity and still winning. But it's like, here he still loses, and a lot of that's because of the decision making that he makes. Again, the fact that he takes Nicole to the end of the game is a massive blunder on his end, where he easily wins against James. If he takes James to the end, James does get votes. He does get like Michelle and Natalie, but it's like Paul gets every other vote. Like, Paul wins that jury vote handily, and the fact that he takes Nicole to the end, someone that he loses against in a 5-4 vote, with one of those votes being Natalie, someone that he actively made bitter, again, that's not a great look. And also, again, like, I just feel like he had very little actual control throughout the game. Like, he was spent so much of the game on the bottom and trying to crawl his way out of the bottom that he wasn't able to actually control what was going on within the game. Even during his HOH week, where he takes out Devon, that was something that he didn't want to do, and that was something that he wasn't even in his best interest. When he flips against Paulie, again, probably the biggest move he makes of the season, like, that was something that, again, wasn't in his best interest at the time, as the group that he flips with instantly flips on him immediately afterwards. So for me, again, like, Paul's game is a lot of him being on the bottom, and even when he's not on the bottom, he's not making the correct decisions that he needs to make in order to insulate himself within the top. And he gets into many situations where he needs to win comps to stay in the game. He needs to win that veto during the week of Victor's second eviction, or he gets voted out there. He needs to win that Final 4 HOH. He doesn't need to win the Final 3 HOH, but he still loses had the other scenario happen where Nicole takes him to the end. So, I mean, like, really, again, for me, I just feel like Paul's BB18 game is a massively flawed game. So because of that, he lands at number 11. Now, number 10, we have another runner-up that, for me, I do look at relatively similarly to Paul, and that person is Alison from BB4. Alison was someone that played an extremely sloppy game, needed to win comps at certain points to get through the game, but was able to actually do so and get to the end of the game. Alison was probably had more control over how the game played out than Paul. However, a lot of that control came from comp wins. I think for me, the biggest problem with Alison is that I just don't see how she wins any scenario at the end. Like, unlike Paul, where I do think Paul wins against probably a decent amount of people, it's just the fact that he picked the wrong person to go to the end with. I don't see how Alison wins a jury vote. I think she loses against literally everybody, but in a way, that's also her greatest boon here, where for me, like, at least Alison knew her optimal move. Again, Paul didn't know his optimal move and made the wrong move. I do feel like Alison knew her optimal move, and that was to get to the end against June, because I do think June is the only person that she would have a sliver of a chance with, and I do think that is something I give Alison credit for, is like, knowing her optimal move and being able to execute on that. The problem is that even her optimal move wasn't enough to win the game. I do think Alison does a terrible job at perception on the season. That's a lot of the reason why she does lose the jury vote, is because everyone's perception of her as being this like weak emotional player. And even when they didn't think of her as this weak emotional player, they thought of her as this really cutthroat player. Is really two distinctions that were really not in her favor. And it was this dichotomy that I think made it very hard for the jury to find respect within her game. Again, for me, like with Alison, it's very similar to Paul. I think she played a very messy game for a lot of the game, but For me, I do feel like Alison had a more accurate read on how the game played out and was able to at least try to get into her best winning scenario. So for me, that's enough to put Alison here at number 10. Now number 9, and now we're starting with the second command runner-ups here. 4 of them in a row here, and this will lead us into the top tier. But here at number 9, the worst of the second command runners-up, in my opinion, is Memphis from BB10. Again, Dan obviously was the more dominant player on the season. Memphis was someone that made moves along with Dan. I do actually give Memphis some credit for being actually better positioned within the game than Dan. I do think this is something that kind of gets forgotten about Dan, is that Dan very likely goes home at that final 5 if him or Memphis had not won the veto there. Like, Dan was in a very tricky spot at the final 5 there. And also at the final 3, he was not in a position to where he gets to the end automatically. However, Memphis was better positioned. Memphis was going to the end with Jerry had Jerry won that final HOH. Memphis was in the best spot with Jerry at the final 5. I do think the thing you have to knock against Memphis, though, is the fact that I just don't see how he wins a jury vote. It's like, if he gets to the end with Jerry, it's like, does Jerry beat him? And if that's the case, then isn't that just really sad? Because, like, I don't think Memphis gets the votes of Keisha. I don't know if he gets the vote of Rennie. I do think he gets Dan's vote, but that might be it, to be honest. Like, Memphis was in a pretty bad spot coming into that final few rounds, and a lot of that's due to Dan sabotaging his game. I do think something that you have to really knock against Memphis is that I do think Memphis, kind of like Orion, who we talked about way back, I do think made moves that benefited Dan's game much more than it benefited his game. Like, him taking out Keisha and the way that he executes that is just so poorly mismanaged there from him. And is really just some of the worst jury management I've seen from a player. I also don't love his early game either, where, like, right off the bat during that first week, he comes off as a massive threat to the point where Brian wants to blindside him there. By the time of week 4, he's on the block and is supposed to be going home. I mean, it's through the grace of Jesse really just kind of blowing up his game, plus also Dan wanting to save him. Though, I mean, to be fair, I mean, it was America's vote that really saved him. But again, Dan did want to save him as well. There was some luck involved in him staying in the vote on that week as well. I mean, really, Memphis for me, again, had a lot of danger earlier on. And even when he got to the back portion of the game where he did thrive a bit more, he was just being outplayed by Dan at every opportunity. So for me, he does land at number 9. Now, number 8, we have someone that, to be fair, I do think this person was probably less of a second command than the other 3 that are within this tier, but they kind of fit the same mold. At number 8 here, I do have Lane from BB12. Again, like, you can consider him a second command to Hayden. I think that was actually probably more of Enzo on the season than Lane. But Lane was still part of the brigade. He was still part of the alliance that did run the entire season. And Lane was the person that Hayden decided to take to the end at the end of the day. For me, the problem with Lane's game is, first up, I think positioning-wise, I don't think he was as secure as the other 3 runners-up that we've talked about. Again, Memphis, I think, was very secure in that he was getting to the end by the time of the end game. The next 2, same thing. I think Lane had a few more spots where his positioning was a bit more precarious. At the final 4, Hayden was actually trying to get Enzo to vote out Lane, which is obviously really bad, especially because Hayden's the one that eventually takes him to the end of the game. Lane was being targeted by Brendan earlier on in the game for being like a floater in the game. I don't think Lane was obviously nearly as secure with his final 2 with Hayden as these other second commands were with their final 2s. However, something I do think you have to give Lane some credit for is the fact that he almost wins the game. I mean, again, it was a 4-3 vote where, again, he actively gets Brittany's vote and is able to get Brennan and Rachel's vote. You only need one more vote to win. The problem is that where's that vote come from? Again, it's another very similar situation to someone like a Cowboy, where it's like, yeah, they can get 3 votes, but it's like, I don't see where another vote comes from. I don't see them winning that jury vote. However, unlike Cowboy, I do feel like Lane wins against Enzo. I think if Lane and Enzo get to the final 2, I do think Lane easily wins that jury vote. I think Lane overall just had a better perception in the end game than some of the runners-up that we've talked about previously. Again, I think Lane was in a better position to win than Memphis. So for me, that's why I did put him one spot above him here at number 8. Now number 7, another runner-up that I kind of just mentioned a little bit ago, and that is Enzo from BB22. Now this one was a very tough one to place. I know a lot of people are really down on Enzo's game, largely due to how the season ended up playing out. However, I think we have to reassess the season as a whole. And again, like the fact that Enzo got through that entire season, all-star season, without ever being targeted, without ever being considered to be nominated is insane. And like while that safety didn't come with a lot of control, I do feel like that portion of his game is still really, really impressive, that he was able to get a lot of people to want to take him to the end. Not in a way that he was being dragged. He wasn't being dragged as a GOAT. Actually, the opposite. Many people thought that he had a good chance of winning the game if he got to the end. He was being taken to the end largely due to his relationships. I think the problem that he faces is a similar problem to a lot of these second command players, and that's that they were too loyal to their final two. I think he was too loyal to Cody, and also was just not as good as Cody in competitions, to where I do think there's a chance Enzo cuts Cody at the end and ends up winning the game if that happens. And to be honest, that's a better winning scenario than someone like Memphis had. Like, again, Memphis didn't really have a chance of winning the game. Lane probably had a chance of winning the game, but wasn't going to take that chance. I think Enzo could have taken that chance that would have gotten him the win. The problem is that he couldn't win the competitions that would have gotten him that position. And that's really the tough thing about Enzo. Again, I think Enzo played most of the game incredibly. It's just really his lack of endgame competitions that really cost him. And then due to his lack of endgame competitions, he obviously could have made changes before that would have allowed him to enter into the endgame in a better position. But even then, it's like, I really feel like his lack of endgame competitions is the biggest flaw within his game. Because again, I feel like he wins in numerous final two scenarios. It's really just the fact that he gets to the end with Cody that he doesn't win, and I don't think he was ever winning that scenario. But the reason why he's at number 7 here instead of number 6 is also because of his lack of control within the game. Again, while he had a lot of pull in the fact that he was able to avoid being nominated and targeted for the entire season, he wasn't ever able to really control how the game was playing out. So because of that, I don't feel like he's as impressive as the number 6 spot, so he lands at number 7. Now at number 6. Again, pretty much the definitive second command player in Big Brother history, we do have Cody Calafiore from BB16. And I think people really hate on Cody's game from BB16, largely because of the decision that he makes at the very end of the game where he takes Derek to the end. However, I think if you look at the rest of the season, plays a really great game. I mean, he plays the second best game of the season. He wins the game against anybody but Derek and maybe Frankie. Again, he 100% wins the game against Victoria, against Caleb, against Christine, like even against Frankie. I do think he has a chance, especially if Derek's there campaigning for him. I mean, like I do feel like Cody plays a very underrated game on BB16. Again, pretty much the perfect second command game. I mean, yes, Derek did dominate the game, but Cody was alongside with him. And I do think Cody was a lot more active in decision making than especially someone like an Enzo was and someone like Elaine was. I do think Cody very much was talking through scenarios with Derek and was helping Derek execute the moves that they were making. However, unlike someone like a Memphis, who I would say probably had a similar level of control, Cody was never targeted like Memphis was earlier on in the game. And also, Cody just straight up had a much better chance of winning the game. Again, he wins the game against anybody but Derek. I think that alone is very, very impressive. I think that's more indicative of how great Derek played than how bad of a game Cody played. Like, I really just feel like it's like minor moves here and there that caused Derek to win the jury vote against Cody. Because at the end of the day, I do think Derek would have done the same thing. I think Derek was always taking Cody to the end. Despite if he thought he was going to win or not, I think just Derek was much better at making sure that he wins at the end against Cody than Cody was the other way around, which we obviously see him rectify in BB22. But here in BB16, that was his greatest flaw. Outside that, though, again, I think he plays a great game. Again, if he had won BB16, he is a top tier winner. Like, he is a dominant winner if he wins BB16. It's just by the merit that he loses that he gets relegated back into the second command sort of position. But again, still a great game overall in my eyes. He does land here at number 6. Now for the top 5. Again, the top 5 for me are pretty definitively top 5 on the runner-up ranking here. I think these are 5 of the most impressive runner-up games, but also 5 of the most dominant runner-up games. However, at number 5 here, I do think this is a bit of an unpopular opinion. I think many people are expecting this to be number 1 or 2 or 3, but really at number 5 here, I do have Dan Gheesling from BB14. And it's kind of funny, like, I mean, again, I do think Dan is the best player to play Big Brother up to this point. I do think we've seen a very impressive win from him in BB10, and a very impressive runner-up game from him in BB14. However, both of them I have placed relatively the same. I think they're both bottom top tier games. And the thing about Dan here for me is that, again, he starts the game very rocky. Very early on in the game, he's not really in the main power structure. Very early on, it is like Boogie and Janelle's groups that come together, and through that they hold the numbers. Dan's really on the outs of that and loses Kara early on. Obviously, he loses Jody very early on and is left with just Danielle. However, through that, I do think he makes a pretty good bond with Brittany and Shane, and through that, those two groups come together and become what ends up becoming the core of the house. I mean, they become the main group that ends up running the show because they end up pulling in Boogie and Frank, and also pull in Ian to really just maintain the majority of the house. Really, coming into the season, Dan had no real shot of ever winning the game. I think just due to the fact that he was a previous winner was something that this cast wasn't going to respect if they got to the end of the game. Really, just a lot of this game is just Dan getting unlucky. I mean, he gets unlucky that he loses some of his members right off the bat, where Jody and Kara go home right away. He gets unlucky that the vets won't stick together, and through that has to get rid of Janelle. He gets unlucky that Boogie ends up going home at 10, where Frank wins the veto, and if not, Frank would have gone home, and in turn, he would have been much better positioned as he had a better relationship with Boogie, and Boogie was someone that was more likely for him to beat at the end of the game. He gets unlucky that a lot of the blame for what Ian was doing throughout the game gets put onto him, and that does ruin his relationships with Boogie and Frank. He gets unlucky that Frank ends up winning a whole bunch of comps, where Frank wins the veto that takes Boogie out, wins the next veto as well to stay during the double eviction, and is able to win Final 8 HOH, which in turn puts Dan in a really terrible spot, where especially after he loses veto, he should be going home, and that's where he pulls off the Dan's funeral move, which is obviously a masterful display of gameplay there, where 1 second he's out the door, and then immediately afterwards he's able to flip the entire game, getting Jen, someone who he didn't have that great of a relationship with at that point, to want to use the veto on him to save him, plus also getting Frank, his biggest rival in the game, to go along with this plan in order to take out Brittany from the game, and essentially put together a 4-person alliance that could have run the table if Dan had decided that he wanted to stick with that group. So again, all that's really impressive. And then from this point forward, he really runs the game. Again, before this, he was either like within the majority alliance, but not really being a major factor within it, or he was really just on the bottom, largely due to unlucky circumstances. But from this point forward, he really just runs the table and again faces a lot of adversity along the way. While he does end up taking out Frank at the final 7, at the final 6 he tries to take out Ian and is unable to do so due to Ian winning the veto. And he does get convinced to keep Shane from Danielle, which I do question that as a move, but he does end up taking out Joe there. He gets very unlucky at the final 5, where both of his best case scenarios win comps. Ian wins HOH, Shane wins veto, and at that point he's forced to get rid of Jen, who was probably his easiest win against at the end, and probably his only winning scenario at that point in the game. He gets to the final 4, where he pulls off this insane move of convincing Danielle to put him in the position where he's able to get rid of Shane. Again, really insane that he's able to pull that off, and able to win her trust back immediately afterwards, and gets into a final 3 scenario where both Ian and Danielle are both taking him to the end, and even gets both of them to throw part 1 of the HOH comp. Again, it's insane what he was able to pull off in that back portion of the game, despite all the adversity that he was faced with. The problem is that he was never winning the game, and again, a lot of that also has to come down to him being a previous winner. Now, I do think he actively burns people along the way, obviously. I do think he actively burns Frank, he actively burns Shane, but most of the other jurors were really just not voting for him because he was a former winner. Or, I mean, to be honest, some were voting pro Ian, obviously, because like Brittany was pro Ian, Ashley was pro Ian, but like people like Joe and Jen didn't like Ian at all and really were just voting anti-Dan. So again, for me, like Dan, I do feel like that back portion game was extremely dominant and some of the most impressive gameplay we've seen, especially considering how much adversity he faced during that portion of the game. But I do feel like the beginning of his game was pretty sloppy and also had very little control during the first half of the game. So for me, when we have other players that were either more likely to win or had more control throughout the entirety of the game, that does leave Dan for me here at number 5. Now, at number 4, we have Someone that I'm kind of surprised is this high, though I guess it kind of makes sense because I do look at this player as a pretty dominant player from this season. And from BB2, we do have Nicole. Now, again, I think Nicole was a dominant player of BB2. I think she dominated the game from a strategic standpoint. Her, along with Hardy, dominated the game from a physical standpoint. And really, I just think Nicole played one of the most dominant games in Big Brother history, and especially in early Big Brother. I think the problem is that she had really terrible jury management and really just never had a chance of winning the game. Again, that's why I do struggle with putting her at number 4 here, because it's she wasn't winning in any scenario. I can't think of a single person she wins against in a final 2. She's very much in a Russell Hantz-esque spot on this list, where it's she dominated the entire season. She played a great game to get to the end. It's just that she couldn't win. I mean, she did play that first week pretty terribly, where she does become the target of Chilltown, but is able to survive that through putting together the top alliance and gets all these other outsiders to come together in order to save her, which I think you have to give her a lot of credit for. She's able to build such a strong bond with Hardy to where their final 2 ride or dies for pretty much the entire season. And through Hardy winning pretty much every other HOH, they're able to pretty much run the entire game, especially after the Boogie Boot, where Hardy wins final 7 HOH, Nicole wins final 6 HOH, Hardy wins final 5 HOH, and it's not until the final 4 that they're once again in danger. But due to Nicole's much superior positioning, where she's able to build a really strong bond with Will to incentivize Will to keep her in the game over Hardy, that does keep her at the game at the final 4. But then at the final 3, she also has Will as someone that's, again, willing to take her to the end had he won final HOH. So really it became a game of not letting Monica win final HOH. So again, for me, I feel like Nicole really masterfully navigated through the game here on the season. The problem is, again, she just doesn't win a jury vote. I think just naturally her personality is not that of the type of personality that people respect, plus also the fact that she was in the top position for a good chunk of the game that made her not very likable when watching a TV show, which obviously played a factor on this season, plus also the fact that she does come off as very hypocritical at points. I do think those were major knocks against her jury chances, but outside of that, I do think she played a pretty masterful game of getting to the end of the game. So for me, that was enough to put her here at number 4. And now number 3, and for me, these top 3 are pretty definitive. I think these are 3 of the best players to not have won the game at this point. Though for me, there was a very clear number 3, and at number 3, I do have Danielle Reyes from BB3. And the main reason for that is because the top 2 were sole dominant games. There were 2 people that did dominate the game on their own. While I feel like Danielle here, first up, she dominated the game along with Jason. She gets shared credit there in their dominance of the game. Mind you, I do think it was Danielle's strategy that allowed them to really dominate the game, where her and Jason came together as a duo, but were able to stay as a secret duo while latching themselves to opposite sides of the house. Danielle obviously sided more with the Marcellus, Amy, Gary side of things, while Jason was able to align with the Lisa, Roddy, Kiara side of things. And through that, they were able to pretty much just dominate the entire house, having all the information from both sides and being able to maneuver between the 2 sides. But then once they start getting towards the end game, they're able to start winning comps, Jason in particular. That allows them to start dictating how the game starts to play out. Danielle does do a better job at positioning herself within the game than Jason, where she does build a really strong bond with Lisa to the point where Lisa is more willing to take her to the final 2 than Jason. However, at the same time, I do think Jason was much better at jury management and building his perception with the jury, to where, again, for me, I find it tough to see Danielle winning a jury vote. And this is probably the biggest knock against Danielle, is that she was actively trying to get into a situation that she knew she was going to lose. She spends the game trying to get to the end with Jason in a situation that she actively says that she thinks Jason's going to beat her. She also takes Lisa towards the end of the game, which is, again, another big mistake, as Lisa also beats her. I do think her best case scenario was getting to the end against Amy, and even then, I don't know for sure that she wins. I know a lot of people say that, oh, she definitely wins if there was a sequestered jury. However, I also don't believe that's the case either. Mind you, I do think it's closer. I do think she definitely gets votes in that scenario. I think she gets the votes of Amy for sure. Could possibly get Kiara. I do think she definitely gets Josh in that scenario. Probably Gary, but it's she still probably doesn't win, though it is a lot closer. But really, I think she was too loyal to Jason, and through that never really positioned herself to actually win the game, which I think is just obviously a massive flaw. I mean, obviously she's better than Nicole for me, who never had a chance of ever winning the game. because I do think Danielle had opportunities. I do think there were chances that if she got to the end, she can win, but she also wasn't trying to get into those situations. Plus also has shared credit for dominating the game along with Jason. So for me, she lands at number 3. Now for the top 2, and I think both of these are pretty obvious. I think they are 2 of the more popular, especially more recent, dominant losing games in the history of Big Brother. The question is, though, which one's number 1, which one's number 2? And coming into this list, the one that's at number 2 here, I really thought was going to be at number 1. But at number 2, I do have to put Paul from BB19. And this was tough. Like, I really thought Paul was number 1, because, like, I will say this, I think Paul played the most dominant game in the history of Big Brother. I think Paul's BB19 game is easily the most dominant game we've ever seen. I think it's the game that showed the most amount of control. I think it's a masterful display of positioning to where he never goes home in any scenario on that season. I mean, he does obviously get targeted by Cody in that first week, and if it hadn't been for pennant protection, he does go on the block, but I think there's no way he goes home in that scenario. And even if we look beyond that, there's never a point ever again where he gets targeted or put on the block. Even in the week where Jessica wins HOH, and he should have been targeted that week, he's able to get Jessica to go after Josh for some reason and not even put him on the block, which is completely ridiculous. He's able to masterfully position himself within the game that by the time of the final 8, every single person that would have potentially targeted him is gone. And by the final 8, essentially, he's guaranteed final 2 as long as he's able to break up the pairs along the way, and he's able to do so. He takes out Matt at final 8, proceeds to take out Jason at final 7, and is able to make inroads within the Josh and Christmas pair to where both of them were going to take him to the end over the other. So essentially, by the time of the final 6, he had guaranteed his spot in the final 2, where literally every single person there was taking him to the end. Raven was taking him. Kevin was taking him. Christmas and Josh were taking him. Alex was taking him. He gets to the end in all of those scenarios. The question is, can he win? And I think this is the biggest knock against Paul's game from BB19 is his jury management, and his jury management was abysmal. Now, I know a lot of people, like, especially now in Big Brother, after seeing so many juries vote quote-unquote bitterly, I do think this concept of a bitter jury is becoming very misconstrued, and this concept of jury management as a whole is becoming very misconstrued within the Big Brother community, because, like, the thing is, like, jury management, a lot of it is luck. There is a lot of luck involved with jury management and how people get the information that they get, how they react to it. Again, there's a lot that isn't in your control because they're in the jury. They're not with you. So it's very tough to manage them when you're not with them. However, I do think Paul does an abysmal job at jury management on this season. I mean, I do think Cody, Mark, and Elena were a lost cause. I think whatever with them. But it's like, the 2 votes that mattered the most, the votes that he needed to win the game, were Alex and Jason, and the way that he treats them on their way out is just abysmal. The way that he lies to them in their goodbye messages is just really terrible, especially with Alex in particular. To be honest, Jason, I kind of get it, because at least at that point he was trying to act it up to Alex that he was still on his side, but Alex, at that point where she was going home, it's very clear what his end game is. Like, he's going with Christmas, Josh, and Kevin. Like, Alex is the biggest threat at that point. Why not just tell her? Don't make up this lie that you're not going to use the veto because these other players would be upset at you if you did. Don't vote for Alex to stay when you know that she's going home. It really just makes you look terrible in the eyes of the jury. And for him to, again, lie to her on the goodbye message, is like, why are you doing this? And that really ends up costing him the game. Now, to be honest, I even then, I think there's a chance he recovers. When he's in the final 2 against Josh, he obviously loses in a 5-4 vote. However, Jason has made it pretty clear that he was willing to vote for Paul had Paul just admitted to what he had done in his game. But in his final jury speech, he again just hammers home he wasn't betraying people at every opportunity. He wasn't actively maneuvering against Alex and Jason and Matt and Raven and all these things. It's like, he tries to make himself look like the good guy. And again, like, it just doesn't work well with the jury like this. Now, obviously, you still have to give him credit for having 4 luck jury votes. At the end, like, he 100% gets those 4 jury votes. There's no way he doesn't get those jury votes. But the fact that he makes the jury so bitter in that position is a massive knock against him. And that is the main reason why he is at number 2 here, because I do feel like the person that was at number 1 did less wrong within the game than Paul did. While Paul had a more dominant game, I think he was much better positioned throughout the entirety of the game than the person at number 1, though even then, to be honest, it's just barely. I do feel like in terms of how they lost the game, I feel like Paul was a lot more active in how he lost the game than the person at number 1, where I do feel like the person at number 1 just got very unlucky with certain circumstances. So for me, because of that, Paul lands here at number 2. Now number 1, the number 1 person on my runner-up ranking, I think should be pretty obvious at this point. There's one very notable person I haven't talked about yet, and at number 1, I do have Tyler Crispin, the runner-up of BB20. Tyler played an extremely dominant game as well. I do think Paul was a lot more active throughout the game in maneuvering around all these different groups in order to dominate the game, while I do feel like Tyler pretty much dominated the game from like week 1 through 5 and then faced some adversity a little bit in the middle, but then pretty much just ran the rest of the season without really doing anything. Like Tyler was very active very early on in the game. We start off with week 1 where he is HOH and he puts up Sam and Steve, with the clear target being Steve. However, the majority of the house wants to keep Steve and get rid of Sam. So what he's able to do is that he's able to lie about Sam's power to Caitlyn in order to get Caitlyn to flip, in the worry that Sam's power might backfire on her. And again, this is just such masterful gameplay here. Again, I do think it's a big move to make early on, and it could have easily backfired on him in the weeks to come. But in order to really solidify his positioning within this season, I do think this was a pretty masterful move. It allowed his alliance, the level 6 alliance, to gain the control of the house, as by keeping Sam in the house, and also by having JC in the house as well, plus also kind of picking up Caitlyn. That becomes 9 people out of the remaining 15 in the house. So that allows him to build the initial power structure there. He then convinces Caitlyn immediately afterwards, after she wins HOH, that she needs to backdoor Swaggy C, the leader of the opposition, is able to execute on that. Again, another pretty masterful move, and now makes the entire house a 9-5 division, with that 5 being completely scattered due to them losing their leader. Then we get to a pretty interesting week as well, week 3, where level 6 does lose here. I mean, Scotty wins HOH. He does target their side, puts up Brett and Winston. However, something that I do think is really interesting about Tyler's game here is that he flips the vote from Brett onto Winston. And this allows them to keep a bigger target in the house, as obviously the opposition was targeting Brett. But also, I think probably more impressively, is that it's able to also create mistrust within the opposition, because by the time that the votes come out, Falte really has no clue who voted which way because of how the previous votes have played out as well. Again, there's just so much distrust within that group that no one knows who is being honest in this situation. This allows Tyler to really still become the center of the house moving forward. He does lose Caitlyn next round, which isn't great. I do think that was definitely a knock for his game, but again, it obviously doesn't really lose him too much power in the game. Next round, he also gets unlucky again with Bailey winning HOH and level 6 being targeted once again, but again, he executes the same move again, this time actually probably being in more adversity, where there was a point where Rachel started to distrust Tyler, and in turn, that's part of the reason why Tyler starts to target Rachel. But this is also where he solidifies his relationship with Angela as well, and is able to get Angela to flip on Rachel as well here, and then pulls off this massive blindside here that again keeps Brett in the game, again causing mistrust within the minority, while also keeping a massive target in the game still. Then after that is where his game kind of goes downhill a little bit. I mean, we get to the Bailey boot, where this wasn't great. I think the way he treats Bailey during this week isn't ideal, plus also the fact that he does get put up by the hacker and does get saved next week. Rockstar ends up going home, but Haley wins HOH, and she does directly go after 2 members of level 6, which I do think this is a point where Tyler was probably in the most danger this week. I mean, he had 2 of his closest allies being the 2 targets for the week in Angela and Casey. He himself was a possible backdoor target. So really, he gets very lucky that the hacker twist is still in play, and in turn is able to get Rockstar on the block and eventually get her out. But I do think this is kind of a rocky spot for his game. I do think this is something that, if you are going to knock anything against Tyler's game, this is probably the week that you're going to knock against him, as this is probably the week that he gets the most lucky out of the entire season. But then after this, he just steamrolls. Again, like, they're able to convince Fessy that Scotty was the person that was betraying them all along, and able to get Fessy takes Scotty out, and then from that point forward, he has no difficulty the entire season. By the time of the final 6, he is essentially guaranteed a spot in the final 2. Even by final 7, he's pretty much there as well. Every single person from the final 6 on was taking him to the end. Brett was, JC was, Casey was, Angela was, Sam was. I do think he mismanages Sam on her way out, which is a lot of the reason why he loses her jury vote, but outside of that, I do think he plays this entire game pretty masterfully and is able to get to the final 4 with his 3 closest allies. I think his problem here is that I think, one, he should have gotten rid of Casey, as Casey was someone that could have potentially beat him, and obviously we later learned that she does, but also like she was also really good in competitions and could have guaranteed her spot to the end where she would beat him. The problem is that he was too loyal to his final 2. Again, a flaw that there's a lot of in runner-up ranking. But also, it's kind of funny that he was so loyal to his final 2 that he gets rid of his showmans in Angela, which by getting rid of his showmans, he essentially ruins his game, because I do think he loses against both JC and Casey in the final 2 under the current format. However, I think if he had gotten to the end against Angela, he easily wins that. So by him allowing Angela to go home, that was a massive flaw in his game. Again, another decently big knock against his winning chances, but he does still get to a final 3 scenario where he gets to the end no matter what. The problem is that he probably loses in the end against both. However, again, like I've talked about this in the past, I do think Tyler could have beat Casey if they were given more time to deliberate. If we had had the old jury format for Big Brother where the jury actually gets to talk to each other after the jury questioning, I do think Tyler wins that. I do think Tyler, obviously he does flip Haley's vote, and through that I do think she could have flipped Fessy for sure, and possibly even Scotty, and I do think Tyler ends up winning the season at that point. Again, it's another extremely dominant game. Again, just like Paul's, again, one person solely dominating the game. The biggest question for me was which one was better. And again, like I do think Paul had more dominance over the game. Paul didn't have that really rocky rock star week where Tyler needed the hacker twist in order to win out that week. There wasn't the positioning misstep that Tyler had where he gets rid of Angela at the final 4 when that was his only winning scenario. But to be fair, that is a winning scenario. Again, with Paul, it's like, who does Paul win against? I don't think Paul wins against anybody. I think Paul loses against Christmas, against Josh, against Kevin, against Alex, against everybody. Like, I don't see who Paul wins against. Well, at least Tyler had a winning scenario there that he did throw away, but at least it was there. Plus, also, I think he wins under slightly different circumstances, again, if they were given more time with the jury. Plus, also, I just feel like he did less actively wrong than Paul, where Paul, like, you can very clearly say Paul's goodbye messages were terrible. The way he treated people on the way out, where he tried to pretend like he was still with them, was terrible. That was terrible jury management. With Tyler, there's not much you can really say for Tyler. I mean, like, he does mismanage Sam. That's probably the biggest thing. I mean, like people like to claim the Bailey stuff, which, I mean, you can do somewhat, but it's like, even then, it's like, I think her vote was more so a pro Casey vote than it was an anti-Tyler vote. You have Rockstar, who was never voting for Tyler to win in any scenario. Fessy, who was like obsessed with the competitions and thought Casey was better at competitions, and also was under the misguided conception that Haley was also voting for Casey to win, which obviously she flips her vote at the last second. I think if he had known that, he flips his vote. And then also you have Scotty, who I think was possibly bitter. Like, I really still don't understand Scotty's vote, because like, it's kind of weird how like Scotty, I guess you can say, was bitter at Tyler because he thought he had a really strong bond with Tyler, but that bond was fake. Like, that was a bond that Tyler made up so that people would associate Tyler and Scotty over the real relationships that Tyler had. So really, it's like, due to Tyler making up a fake allegiance that he had with Scotty, that Scotty should have known that they didn't have, that he doesn't get Scotty's vote. I don't know. It's really convoluted. I really still don't get Scotty's vote. But either way, I do feel like Tyler did less wrong within his game to lose the game than Paul. So Tyler's here at number 1. So there we go. That's my runner-up ranking. Every runner-up in the history of Big Brother up to this point. Again, I will be continuing on this runner-up series down the road, where I would like to do the same thing for all the other shows that I cover. So Australian Survivor, Survivor South Africa, merge those into an international Survivor ranking down the road as well. Maybe The Amazing Race. We'll see. I wouldn't be opposed to also doing a North American Big Brother ranking, like I've done with my winter and season rankings down the road as well. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.